The beeping came first, steady and mechanical, one tone every second, the kind of sound that belongs to machines keeping someone alive. Then the hum of something forcing air through a tube, and the fluorescent lights above her, blue, white, and relentless, turning everything the color of milk left out too long. Kristen Whitfield opened her eyes and could not remember where she was. Her mouth was dry enough that her tongue stuck to the roof of it. Her throat burned with a raw soreness that went deeper than a cold or a scream, the kind of soreness that came from something being shoved down it while she was unconscious. She tried to move her right hand and felt the tug of tape and the pinch of an IV needle anchored to the vein above her wrist. Her fingernails still had polish on them, chipped and peeling, the dark red she had painted on Sunday night in front of the television. That felt like a different lifetime. A nurse came in. She was maybe 40, with a calm face and efficient hands, and she checked the IV bag before she even looked at Kristen. "You're at OHSU," the nurse said. "Oregon Health and Science University, in Portland. You were brought in last night after a motor vehicle accident on Highway 26. Your car rolled. You had internal bleeding and a ruptured spleen, and the surgical team operated for 9 hours to repair the damage." Kristen tried to process the words one at a time. Accident. Highway 26. She had been driving from Bend to Portland because her friend had asked her to come for the weekend. The rain had been terrible. She remembered that. She remembered the curve and the way the steering wheel stopped listening to her hands. 9 hours, Kristen repeated. 9 hours, the nurse confirmed. You lost a significant amount of blood. The surgeon who led the operation saved your life. Kristen swallowed against the rawness in her throat. Who was it? The surgeon. The nurse reached for the post-op report clipped to the rolling tray beside the bed. She turned it so Kristen could see and pointed at the line near the top of the first page where the lead surgeon's name was printed in small, clean type. Dr. L. Whitfield. Kristen read it once. Then she read it again, slower, the way you reread a sentence in a letter that changes everything that came before it. Whitfield. The same last name printed on her own driver's license, on her father's mailbox in Bend, on the lease to the house where she grew up. She looked at the nurse, and the nurse looked back at her with the practiced neutrality of someone who had already been told what to say and what to leave out. "She asked me to tell you the surgery went well," the nurse said. She didn't leave any other message. The monitor beside the bed picked up the change before Kristen's face did. The beeping quickened, the gap between tones shrinking, and the number on the screen climbed from 72 to 89 in the time it took her to look down at her own hands. There was still dried blood under her fingernails, worked into the cuticles where it would take days to scrub out. Someone had opened her up, reached inside her body, spent 9 hours finding every tear and repairing it stitch by stitch, and then closed her back together. And that someone shared her last name. The same last name she had taken from a 13-year-old girl standing in a kitchen doorway on a night when the rain would not stop. "Is she still here?" Kristen asked. Dr. Whitfield stepped out. "She asked me to tell you the surgery went well. Did she say anything else?" "Just that the surgery went well, ma'am." Kristen stared at the ceiling. The fluorescent tubes buzzed above her, indifferent, and the monitor kept counting her heartbeats like a clock that only knew one direction. 12 years earlier, it was raining. The kind of rain that makes you wonder if the sky is trying to hurt someone specifically. I was 13, and I was doing homework on the living room floor because the desk in my bedroom had a broken leg that my father kept saying he would fix. The carpet smelled like the dog we used to have, even though the dog had been gone for 2 years. Kristen was in the kitchen with our father, Dennis. I could hear pieces of what she was saying, low and careful, the way you talk when you have practiced something and you want to get the words in the right order. My father said nothing. He was a man who treated silence like a verdict. Then he called my name. "Leah, come here." The linoleum was cold under my bare feet. The fluorescent light above the stove had been flickering for a week, throwing shadows that jumped and reset, and the whole room smelled like the coffee my father drank all day, pot after pot, until it turned bitter enough to strip paint. Kristen stood behind him with her arms crossed and her eyes pointed at the floor. She would not look at me. My father did not stand up. He stayed in his recliner, the brown corduroy one he sat in every Sunday to watch football, and he pointed at me with the same hand he used to change channels. His hand was steady. He was calm the way people are calm when they have already made a decision and the conversation is just a formality. He told me that Kristen had told him something. He told me that my mother had confessed the truth before she disappeared. He told me I was not his daughter, and I needed to leave his house. I asked him if he was sure. I asked if there was a test, some kind of proof. He said he did not need a test. Kristen knew. My mother knew. The whole family knew except him. I looked at Kristen. I waited for her to shake her head, to say it was a mistake, to look at me with the face of my older sister who had braided my hair in the bathroom when I was 9. She kept staring at the floor. I went upstairs and put clothes in my backpack. I came back down and my father had turned the television on again, some commercial playing too loud for the size of the room. I walked past him. He did not turn around. The front door closed behind me, and the rain hit my face so hard it felt personal, like something aimed. The gas station was 2 miles from our house. I walked the whole way with my backpack getting heavier as the rain soaked through the canvas. And when I got there, I stood under the overhang by the air pump and called my Aunt Lorraine from the payphone. My hands were shaking too badly to put the coins in on the first try. Auntie, Dad kicked me out. She did not ask why. She did not ask what happened, or what I had done, or whether I was sure. She said, "Stay right there." 3 hours. And exactly 3 hours later, her headlights cut through the rain in the gas station parking lot, and she got out of the car and wrapped a blanket around me and put me in the passenger seat without saying a single unnecessary word. My father pointed at a door without getting up from his chair. My aunt drove 3 hours through a storm without asking a question. 2 definitions of family, delivered on the same night. 12 years later, I was living in Portland in a studio apartment on Northwest 23rd that I kept clean enough to perform surgery in. The hardwood floors were original and slightly warped near the kitchen, and the kitchen itself had a stove I had never turned on and a refrigerator that held exactly what I needed for the week, measured and labeled. The only living thing in the apartment besides me was a pothos plant on the windowsill that I watered every Sunday morning before calling Lorraine. Every Sunday at 7 in the evening, same time, same routine. Lorraine never asked about the big things first. She always started the same way. "What did you eat this week?" Then she listened, and sometimes she told me about a patient at the community hospital in Salem where she worked, and sometimes she told me the potatoes at the farmer's market were getting expensive, and that was enough. It was always enough. I was a second-year surgical resident at OHSU, which meant 14-hour shifts and meals from the cafeteria at 2 in the morning, and the kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones like sediment. The attendings trusted me. The nurses called me by name. I had the steadiest hands in my residency class, which was something the chief resident mentioned at rounds once in front of everyone, and I had nodded and said thank you, and gone home that night and sat on my kitchen floor and cried for 40 minutes without understanding why. That Wednesday evening before my night shift, I could not sleep. I lay in bed and scrolled through my phone, through the contacts I never called, and my thumb stopped on a name I had not opened in 12 years. Dad. Below it, a saved voicemail from the week after he threw me out. I had listened to it once, the night I received it, standing in Lorraine's guest bathroom with the door locked. "When you come to your senses, you know my number. I won't be the one apologizing." I had never played it again. I had never deleted it either. It sat there in my phone through every upgrade and every transfer, following me from middle school to high school to college to medical school to this apartment, like a splinter too deep to reach. I put the phone down and got dressed. Scrubs, sneakers, the $12 Casio watch I wore because it was accurate to the second and I believed in things that worked exactly as they were supposed to. I clipped my name badge to my chest, Dr. L. Whitfield, and walked through the rain to the hospital. I had built everything from nothing. Every grade, every shift, every hour spent standing over an open body learning where to cut and where to leave alone. Nobody gave me any of it. Nobody could take it from me. That was what I told myself, and most days I believed it. The storm hit Portland hard that night. The emergency department filled fast with the usual winter casualties, people who had hydroplaned on the freeway or caught a falling branch across the windshield or slipped on a wet sidewalk and broken something they would need for the next 6 weeks. I sutured a laceration on a teenager's forehead, checked x-rays for a woman who thought her wrist was fractured, and signed discharge papers for a man with a concussion and a strong opinion about studded tires. Then the intercom crackled and the charge nurse's voice cut through the noise of the department. Trauma alert. Motor vehicle collision, Highway 26. Female, late 20s. Unresponsive. ETA, 8 minutes. I pulled on a fresh pair of gloves and checked the OR board. Operating room 3 was open. Dr. Fan, the attending on call, was 2 hours deep into an emergency cholecystectomy in OR 1 and would not be out anytime soon. I was the only surgical resident on the floor with trauma clearance. The ambulance siren was already building in the distance, growing louder with each second, and the red lights from the rig swept across the glass doors of the ER entrance as it pulled into the bay. The paramedics brought the gurney through the double doors, and I stepped forward the way I had done dozens of times before, already reading the scene, already calculating. Female patient, mid to late 20s, cervical collar, 2 large bore IVs running wide open, blood pressure dropping. And then I saw her face. I had not seen that face in 12 years, but I knew it before the chart confirmed anything. The jawline was the same, the eyebrows were the same, the mouth was the same mouth that had whispered something to my father in a kitchen while I sat on the living room floor doing homework and pretending I could not hear. The chart read, Whitfield, Kristen A., 27-year-old female, motor vehicle accident, rollover, hypotensive, suspected splenic rupture. One of the nurses noticed me staring and touched my elbow. Dr. Whitfield, do you know this patient? 3 seconds passed. The longest 3 seconds of my residency. Prep or 3. I need to scrub. Doctor, if there's a personal connection, protocol says another surgeon should take over. Her blood pressure is 80/50 and falling. She has a ruptured spleen. Dr. Fan is in surgery for at least another 2 hours. If I wait for him, she bleeds out. Prep the OR. The nurse held my eyes for a second, measuring something, and then she turned and began calling orders to the team. Every textbook I had ever read said a surgeon should not operate on a family member. The emotional compromise, the risk of impaired judgment, the liability exposure. Every textbook was right. But the textbooks were written for hospitals with backup surgeons available at midnight during a rainstorm, and this was not that hospital on this particular night. She was a patient. She was a 27-year-old female with a ruptured spleen and a blood pressure that was dropping every minute I stood there thinking about ethics. She had not been my sister for 12 years. I walked to the scrub sink and turned on the water. I pushed through the doors of OR 3. The surgical lights were bright enough to bleach the color out of everything underneath them, and the operating table sat in the center of the room like an altar. Kristen lay on it with her eyes closed and a tube down her throat, and blood on the sheet beneath her. I looked down at my hands over the sterile field. Steady. They were always steady, even when the rest of me was something else entirely. I had 9 hours ahead of me. I did not think about anything except the next cut, and the cut after that, and the 9 hours of cuts that would follow. That is what I told myself, and for most of those 9 hours, it was almost true. The first 2 hours were the easiest. I had the spleen exposed within 40 minutes, and the damage was worse than the scans had suggested. 3 separate tears in the parenchyma, the largest one bleeding freely into the abdominal cavity, and the kind of vascular compromise that meant every minute counted twice. I clamped. I suctioned. I worked the first tear with the focus of someone diffusing a device on a timer, and for those 2 hours my hands belonged to the surgery and the rest of me did not exist. Kristen was not Kristen. She was tissue and vasculature and a heart rate on a monitor and a set of problems I had been trained to solve. Somewhere around hour 4, the exhaustion began to settle in. I had been on my feet since 7 that evening, and the adrenaline that had carried me through the first hours was thinning out, replaced by the slow heaviness that collects in your lower back and the muscles behind your knees when you have been standing in one position for too long. The scrub nurse handed me a suture, and I looked up from the operative field to adjust my headlamp, and for 1/2 of 1 second I saw Kristen's face above the drape, the angle of her jaw, the way her eyebrows arched even while she was unconscious, and I was back in that kitchen, 13 years old, watching a 15-year-old girl stand behind our father with her arms crossed and her eyes on the floor. The fluorescent light above the stove was flickering. The coffee was cold. Kristen would not look at me. I blinked. The memory broke apart. I looked down at the operative field and said suture, and my voice came out steady, and my hands did not shake, and the scrub nurse handed me what I needed without knowing that anything had happened at all. The last hour was the quietest. I was closing, layer by layer, and the emergency was over, and the hemorrhaging was controlled, and the monitors showed stable vitals and a blood pressure that was climbing back toward something the body could sustain. I placed each stitch with the care of someone sewing shut, an envelope that contained something they would never open again. I knew what I was doing. I was putting my sister back together. I was stitching closed the body of the girl who had whispered a lie that split my life in half, and I was doing it with the same hands that had learned to hold a scalpel because of that lie, and the symmetry of it was so precise it almost felt like something I had planned. The last suture held. I checked her vitals one more time. Stable, heart rate 74, blood pressure 108/62. I stepped back from the table, pulled off my gloves, and dropped them in the bin by the door. I did not look at her face again. The corridor outside OR3 was empty and bright with morning light coming through the windows at the far end. I made it 6 steps before my legs decided they were finished cooperating. I leaned against the wall and stayed there with my palms flat against the cool tile and my forehead resting on the back of my hands. My knees were shaking. The tremor was small enough that nobody walking past would have noticed, but I felt it all the way up through my hips and into the base of my spine. For 9 hours I had been a surgeon. The surgery was over. I had nothing left to hide inside. Dr. Fan found me there. He had finished his cholecystectomy and come looking for the trauma case report, and he stood at the end of the hallway holding the chart I had filled out during the post-op handoff. He looked at the chart. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at the chart again, specifically at the line where the patient's last name was printed. "Same last name," he said. "Coincidence? She's my sister." Dr. Fan was quiet for several seconds. He closed the chart and held it against his chest. "You should have told us, Leah. If I had told you, who would have operated on her?" He did not answer. We both knew the math. Kristen was alive because I had not waited. The ethics board would review the case, and the outcome would justify the decision. "One more thing," Dr. Fan said. "We notified next of kin, a Dennis Whitfield, listed as her father. He's driving from Bend." Something tightened in my chest, a fast, involuntary contraction in the muscles between my ribs, the kind of response you cannot train away no matter how many years you spend teaching yourself to stand still in emergencies. I kept my face the same. "How far is Bend?" "About 3 hours. Then I have 3 hours. Doctor." Fan looked at me the way he looked at residents who were showing signs of fatigue during a long shift, the quiet, clinical assessment of someone deciding whether to intervene. He decided against it. He nodded once and walked back toward the surgical floor with the chart under his arm, and I stayed against the wall and counted the 3 hours I had left before the pass drove into the parking lot wearing work boots and smelling like motor oil. I heard his voice before I saw him. I was standing near the end of the hallway that connected the ICU wing to the main corridor, close enough to the nurses' station to hear the reception area, but far enough to stay out of direct sight. Dennis was speaking to the woman at the front desk. His voice was the same, low and unhurried, the voice of a man accustomed to being listened to without raising his volume, and it had not changed at all in 12 years. The words were different. He was asking about his daughter. He was asking which room, but the tone was the same tone that had told me I was not his child while the rain hammered the windows and the coffee went cold on the counter. His boots made a heavy, deliberate sound on the linoleum. He smelled like motor oil and cold air. He had driven straight from Bend after the hospital called 3 hours on Highway 26 inches, the same rain that had put his daughter in surgery. His hands were large and rough, with grease darkened into the creases of his knuckles. He stopped at the whiteboard outside the ICU entrance, the one that listed the patients and their attending physicians and their room numbers. I watched him scan it. I watched him find the name Whitfield and follow the line across to the column where the lead surgeon was listed. Dr. L. Whitfield. I watched him read it, and then read it again, and then turn his head slowly down the length of the hallway until he found me standing there in my scrubs with my name badge still clipped to my chest. 12 years. Dennis stared at me and I stared back. He was 55 now, and he looked it. The hair was more gray than brown and thinner at the temples, and his face had the weathered texture of a man who spent his days on rooftops and in crawl spaces, exposed to whatever the Oregon climate decided to throw at him. His shoulders were still broad, but they sat lower than I remembered, pulled down by something heavier than age. He opened his mouth and closed it and opened it again. Leah. His voice cracked on the second syllable the way wood cracks when it has been carrying weight for too long. I said nothing. I stood there with my hands at my sides and let the silence do what silence does in a hospital corridor at 11 in the morning, when a father sees the daughter he threw away 12 years ago standing in front of him wearing a surgeon's badge. Dennis walked toward me. His steps were slower than they used to be. He stopped about 6 feet away, close enough for me to see the red in his eyes and the way his chin was trembling, and then he sat down in one of the plastic waiting room chairs that lined the wall. He sat the way he always sat, leaning back with his arms crossed over his chest, his body taking up space the way it was accustomed to taking up space. The same posture, the same angle, the same unconscious claim to the furniture beneath him, as though every chair he touched became his recliner and every room became his living room. My God, Dennis said. Leah, you're a doctor, surgeon. You saved her. His eyes were wet and his voice was doing something I had never heard it do before, folding in on itself like a piece of paper being crumpled slowly. You saved Kristen. She was my patient. She had a ruptured spleen. Leah, I made a terrible mistake. I know that. I have known that for years, and I should have found you. And I am so sorry. I am so sorry for what I did. I know, I said. I have the voicemail. Dennis looked at me and I could see the confusion pass across his face, the brief scramble of a man trying to remember what he had said into a phone 12 years ago and realizing he could not. I could have recited it for him. I had memorized every word without meaning to, the way your body memorizes the location of a bruise. When you come to your senses, you know my number. I won't be the one apologizing. Then Dennis began to cry. I had never seen my father cry. I had seen him angry and I had seen him quiet and I had seen him drunk on the 4th of July once when I was 9, but I had never seen tears on his face. They came without warning and without sound, just water running from his eyes and into the stubble along his jaw, and his shoulders shook once and then again, and then steadily, like an engine trying to turn over in the cold. He said he was sorry. He said he had been wrong. He said please, and for 3 seconds I believed him. For 3 seconds I was 13 again, standing at the kitchen doorway with my backpack already packed, waiting for my father to stand up from that recliner and say the one sentence that would undo everything. Come back. I was wrong. You are my daughter, and I am sorry, and come back. I had waited 12 years for those words, and now he was saying them in a hospital hallway that smelled like bleach and industrial floor cleaner. 12 years too late. And 3 hours away from the house where he had pointed at the door without getting out of his chair. He was saying them. 3 seconds. Then the 13-year-old girl dissolved, and the 25-year-old surgeon came back, and I stood there in my scrubs and my sensible shoes and my $12 watch, and I understood that the tears were real, and the apology was real, and none of it was enough. It would never be enough, because an apology is a request. And what he was requesting was permission to stop feeling guilty, and that was something I could not give him in a hallway and could not give him anywhere. Kristen's in recovery, I said. Room 412. You can see her when she wakes up. I turned and walked back down the corridor toward the surgical floor. I did not hug him. I did not forgive him. I did not look back to see whether he stayed in that plastic chair or followed me or put his face in his hands. I just walked, one foot and then the other, the way I had walked out of his house at 13 and down a wet road to a gas station with a payphone. I told myself it was enough. I told myself I did not need anything else from him, that the surgery and the silence and the walking away had closed something that needed closing, and now I could go back to being doctor. Whitfield and he could go back to being the man in Bend who once had 2 daughters and chose one. I was wrong about that too. Dennis found me in the cafeteria 2 hours later. I was sitting at a table near the back with a cup of coffee I had not touched and a granola bar I had opened but could not bring myself to eat. I had been awake for 18 hours. My scrubs smelled like surgical antiseptic and sweat, and my name badge had a crease in the laminate from where I had been gripping it without realizing, running my thumb across the letters the way someone else might worry a coin or a rosary. He sat down across from me without asking. His hands were flat on the table. The grease still worked into the lines of his knuckles. He looked at me with an expression I was supposed to interpret as honesty, as a father ready to lay himself bare. "I want to explain," Dennis said. "I owe you that. You owe me more than that. Kristen told me your mother had admitted it," he said. His voice was careful, rehearsed. "She told me your mother confessed before she left, that you weren't mine. I believed my own daughter, Leah. What father wouldn't? A father who asks for proof. I was destroyed. Your mother had already ripped my life apart, and then Kristen comes to me and tells me this, and I just—" He trailed off and rubbed his face with both hands, pressing his palms into his eyes. I reacted badly. You reacted by putting a 13-year-old girl outside in a thunderstorm. You could have called, Dennis said, and his voice shifted. The careful arrangement of bricks wobbled. Something harder pushed through underneath. You had Lorraine's phone number. You had options. You chose to disappear. For 12 years, Leah. You chose that. I set my coffee cup down and looked at him across the table. I was 13, and Kristen was 15. She was a kid, too. She thought she was telling the truth. She was 15, I said. I was 13. Which one of us was the kid that night, Dennis? That's not fair. Neither was the thunderstorm. He went quiet. The cafeteria noise filled the space between us. Trays clattering and a television mounted on the wall playing something with a laugh track. Dennis stared at the table for a long time and then looked up at me with wet eyes and said the sentence I had been waiting for him to say since I walked away from him in the hallway. We can be a family again, Leah. We can start fresh. Put all of this behind us. Start fresh. 2 words that erased 12 years of gas station payphones and foster paperwork and scholarship applications at Lorraine's kitchen table and anatomy textbooks paid for with student loans. As if those 12 years were a rough draft that could be crumpled up and rewritten with a version where the father was sorry and the daughter came home and the storm had never happened. I tried reaching out, Dennis added, and my jaw tightened the way it tightened every time I thought about the voicemail. One voicemail. One message left on a 13-year-old girl's phone while the rain was still drying on her face. When you come to your senses, you know my number. I won't be the one apologizing. That was his version of reaching out. That was the full extent of his effort. I stood up from the table and left my untouched coffee and my unopened granola bar, and I walked out of the cafeteria without saying another word. I understood something in that moment that I had not understood in the hallway. Dennis did not want me back because he missed me. He wanted me back because my absence was the evidence of what he had done, and as long as I was gone, the evidence was visible. If I came home, if I forgave him, if I agreed to start fresh, then the crime disappeared, and the guilt dissolved, and he could go back to being the man he told himself he was. A good father, a wronged husband, a man who did his best. He did not want a daughter. He wanted an eraser. I went back to Kristen's room at 3 p.m. because her post-op vitals needed reviewing and I was still the surgeon of record, professional obligation. The alternative was to hand her case to another resident and file the transfer paperwork, and I had decided I would do that tomorrow, but today she was still mine in the way that patients belong to the doctors who opened them up and put them back together. Dennis was sitting in the chair beside the bed. Kristen was awake. The color had not returned to her face, and the IV line ran from the bag on the pole down to the back of her left hand, where the tape held the needle in place. The hospital gift shop carnations Dennis had bought sat in a plastic cup on the bedside table, cheap white flowers that were already beginning to wilt in the dry, recycled air. The room smelled like antiseptic, and those flowers, and the particular staleness of a space that had been occupied by sick people for longer than the ventilation could manage. Kristen looked at me when I came through the door. Her eyes held everything at once. I could see the fear and the gratitude and the guilt, and something older beneath all of it. Something that looked the way shame looks when it has been carried for so long it has become part of the skeleton. I picked up her chart from the hook at the foot of the bed and started reading. "Your vitals are stable," I said. "You'll need to stay 3 to 5 days for observation. The surgical team will monitor for any secondary complications." "Leah." I kept my eyes on the chart. "Pain level, 1 to 10. "Leah. Please." 1 to 10, Kristen. "I'm sorry." Her voice broke on the second word, splitting open the way a piece of fruit splits when you press your thumb into the soft part. "I am so sorry." I lowered the chart. I looked at her face, the face I had seen above the surgical drape during hour 4 when the exhaustion cracked my concentration, the face of the 15-year-old girl who had stood behind our father with her arms crossed and her eyes on the linoleum. I looked at her and I asked the question that I already knew would cost me something to hear answered. For what, specifically? For everything. For all of it. Everything is a word people use when they want credit for an apology without having to say what they did. Be specific, Kristen. Dennis shifted in his chair. "Leah. She just had major surgery. She's in pain. Can you show some compassion?" I turned to Dennis. My voice did not rise. It did not need to. "Compassion? I showed your daughter compassion for 9 hours last night, with a scalpel, in an operating room. While you were asleep in bed." The room went still. The monitor beeped. Dennis looked at the floor. And then Kristen began to speak, and what came out of her mouth was not the apology I had spent 12 years rehearsing rebuttals against. It was something worse. It was the truth. "Mom was leaving," Kristen said. Her voice was small and rough from the intubation, barely louder than the hum of the IV pump. I heard her on the phone one night. She was talking to someone and she said she was going to leave and she was going to take you with her. She said your name. She said she was taking Leah. I did not move. I did not breathe. The chart was still in my hands and my fingers had gone white around the edges of the clipboard. "I was 15, Kristen said. "I was 15 and Mom was going to leave me with Dad and take you, and I would lose both of you. So I told Dad you weren't his. I thought if he sent you away first, Mom wouldn't have a reason to go. She would stay. She would stay for me." The monitor beeped. The carnations wilted. The fluorescent light above the bed hummed the same frequency as the one in the kitchen 12 years ago. "She left anyway," Kristen whispered. 3 months later. She packed a bag on a Tuesday morning and drove away, and she didn't take either of us. I stood there holding a medical chart in a hospital room that smelled like dying flowers, and I felt the architecture of 12 years collapse inside my chest. For 12 years I had carried a clean story. My sister hated me. My father believed her. They threw me away because I was unwanted, and I survived because I was strong, and I became a surgeon because strength was the only currency that could never be devalued. The story was simple, and it was mine, and it had a villain, and a victim, and a clear moral about what happens when you bet against the girl in the thunderstorm. Kristen had not hated me. She had been a 15-year-old girl who was terrified of being left alone, and she had reached for the only weapon a child knows how to use, which is a lie. And the lie had worked exactly the way she designed it to, and it had destroyed everything it was supposed to save. And my father had not been cruel. He had been weak. He had heard what he wanted to hear because the alternative was asking a question whose answer might hurt worse than the lie. Weak was harder to fight than cruel. You can build a life in opposition to cruelty. You can sharpen yourself against it until every edge is clean. Weakness just sits there, soft and shapeless, and there is nothing to push against. Dennis stood in the corner of the room with his hands at his sides. He had not known this, or he had suspected something and chosen, for 12 years, to leave the suspicion unexamined, because examining it would have meant admitting that he had thrown his daughter into a rainstorm based on the word of a frightened teenager and a wife who had already betrayed him in every other way. I put the chart down on the bedside table next to the carnations. I walked out of the room. I did not run, but my pace was faster than it needed to be, and by the time I reached the elevator at the end of the hallway, I was gripping the strap of my badge so tightly that the clip left a dent in the pad of my thumb. My car was a Honda Civic I had bought for $4,200 cash during my intern year. It sat in the same spot on the 3rd level of the parking garage. The overhead lights flickered. Rain was still falling, hitting the concrete above me and running down through the drainage gaps, a steady white noise that enclosed the car like a second set of walls. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine off and my hands on the steering wheel. The coffee from that morning was still in the cup holder, cold and forgotten. I looked at my hands and watched them tremble. These were the hands that had kept Kristen alive for 9 hours, the hands the chief resident had called the steadiest in the program. They were shaking now, in the dark, in the car, because there was finally nothing left to do and nowhere left to put what I was carrying. I had become a surgeon because surgery was the one arena where my value was beyond dispute. You do not question the worth of the person holding the scalpel while your loved one is bleeding on the table. Every successful operation was a receipt, a proof of purchase, a document that said, "This person deserves to exist." I had been collecting those receipts for 12 years, stacking them against the memory of a man who had not considered me worth a $30 test from the pharmacy on 4th Street. I had saved Kristen's life, 9 hours of flawless work, and Dennis had looked at me afterward and said we could start fresh, as though my entire career, my entire self, was just the intermission between being his daughter and being his daughter again. He did not see a surgeon who had saved someone. He saw a convenient opportunity to stop feeling bad. I could have rebuilt the entire hospital with my bare hands, and he still would have looked past the building and straight at his own reflection in the glass. That was what I had been to him for as long as I could remember, a surface for him to see himself in. I had spent 12 years proving I was worth keeping, to a man who had never once considered I was worth checking. The phone sat on the dashboard, the screen dark. I picked it up and scrolled to Lorraine's name and pressed call. It was 3 a.m. The phone rang once, and then again, and on the third ring her voice came through, thick with sleep but already sharpening into alertness, the way it did when something mattered. "Leah? What's wrong?" "Kristen was in my OR tonight. Car accident on Highway 26. I operated for 9 hours. Lorraine was quiet for several seconds. I could hear her breathing and the creak of bed springs as she sat up. "Is she alive?" "Yes." "And Dennis?" "He's here, at the hospital." Another pause. Then Lorraine asked the question she always asked, the question she had been asking every Sunday evening at 7 for 12 years, the question that had never changed and would never change, because it was the foundation of everything she believed about what it meant to take care of someone. "Did you eat anything?" I laughed. It came out of me without permission, a short broken sound that was closer to a cough than anything joyful, and it echoed inside the car and bounced off the windshield and disappeared into the rain outside. I was sitting in a parking garage at 3 a.m. after the longest night of my life, and my aunt was asking me if I had eaten. She was not asking whether I had forgiven Dennis. She was not asking what I planned to do about Kristen. She was not asking me to explain or justify or narrate the events of the past 18 hours in a way that made sense. She was asking about food, because Lorraine understood something that Dennis had never learned and would probably never learn, which is that love is not a grand gesture or a tearful apology in a hospital hallway. Love is the question that stays the same. Love is showing up with the same concern on the worst night as on every other night. Love is, "Did you eat?" "I'm driving up," Lorraine said. 3 hours. "You don't have to do that." "I know. 3 hours." The same words. The same response. 12 years ago, she had driven through a storm to collect a 13-year-old girl from a gas station. Tonight, she would drive through the dark to collect a 25-year-old woman from a parking garage. The distance between those two moments was 12 years and also nothing at all. I hung up the phone and leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes. The rain kept falling. My hands had stopped shaking. Something had shifted, quietly, in the space behind my ribs where I kept the things I could not say out loud. I did not need Dennis to see what I had built. I did not need Kristen to understand what her lie had cost. I did not need the voicemail to be answered or the recliner to be empty or the thunderstorm to be undone. The only thing I needed was already on her way, driving through the dark from Salem with the heater on and the radio off, and she would be here in 3 hours, and she would bring nothing except herself, and that would be enough. It had always been enough. Lorraine arrived at 6 a.m. She tapped on the window with 2 knocks, patient and unhurried. I unlocked the door and she got in the passenger seat and put a paper bag on my lap. Inside was a blueberry muffin from a gas station on I-5, the kind wrapped in plastic that tastes like sugar, and the particular kindness of someone who stopped in the dark to buy you something to eat. We sat together for a while without saying much. Lorraine ate half of a second muffin and brushed the crumbs off her lap and told me the drive had been foggy south of Woodburn. I ate my muffin. It was the first food I had put in my body in over 20 hours, and my hands were steady again, and the rain had slowed to something lighter that barely registered on the windshield. At 7, I told Lorraine I needed to go back inside. She looked at me for a long time, the way she had looked at me in the rearview mirror of her car 12 years ago, when she drove me away from that gas station, reading my face for something she trusted more than words. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm going to say what I need to say. Then I'm going to come home." She nodded. She did not ask what I planned to say, or whether I was sure, or whether I had thought it through. She reached across and squeezed my hand once and let go. I got out of the car and walked back into the hospital with muffin crumbs on my scrubs and my name badge still clipped to my chest, where it had been clipped for the past 36 hours. Kristen was awake in room 412. Dennis was asleep in the chair beside her bed, his chin on his chest and his arms folded the way they always folded, claiming the furniture even in unconsciousness. The carnations on the bedside table were fully wilted now, their petals brown at the edges and curling inward. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. Kristen saw me come in and her whole body stiffened under the blanket, the flinch of someone who was not sure whether the person entering the room was a doctor or a reckoning. "I didn't save you because you're my sister," I said. My voice was quiet and level and it belonged to someone who had finished fighting. "I saved you because you were dying on my table, and that is what I trained to do. I need you to understand that. If you think this means I've forgiven you, or that we're going to be a family again, I want to be honest with you. We are not." Kristen's eyes filled. The monitor picked up the change in her pulse, the beeping quickening just slightly. "Then why are you here?" she asked. I looked at Dennis sleeping in the chair. The flannel shirt was wrinkled and the grease was still in his knuckles, and he looked older than 55, worn down to something smaller than the man who had filled that recliner in the living room 12 years ago. "Because I have something to say to him," I said. "And you deserve to hear it too." I woke Dennis by saying his name once. He startled the way deep sleepers do, the confused blink and the sharp intake of breath, and the 3 seconds of disorientation before the room assembled itself into a place he recognized. He looked at Kristen. He looked at me. He started to speak. "I need to talk to you," I said. "Outside, in the hallway." He followed me out. The corridor was early morning quiet. The overhead lights were on, but the light coming through the windows at the far end was stronger, pale and clean and winter bright. The vending machine hummed. The linoleum was freshly mopped and reflected everything above it. I stood on one side of the corridor. Dennis stood on the other. I was still wearing the scrubs I had put on 36 hours ago, and the name badge on my chest had the crease in the laminate from where I had been gripping it in the cafeteria the day before. Dennis was in his jeans and his flannel and his work boots, the clothes he had driven 3 hours in, the clothes he had slept in, the uniform of a man who had come to this hospital expecting a reunion and was about to receive something else entirely. Dennis sat down in one of the plastic hallway chairs and leaned back and crossed his arms. The posture was automatic. He had been sitting that way his whole life, in the recliner on football Sundays, at the kitchen table when he told me to leave, in the waiting room when he cried. Every chair became his recliner. "Leah, I want you to know that I have thought about this every day for the last 12 years, and Stand up." Dennis stopped. He looked up at me, confused. "If you have something to say to me, you can stand up and say it. You sat in that recliner 12 years ago and pointed at the door without getting out of your chair. You pointed a 13-year-old girl into a thunderstorm, and you did not even stand up to do it. You do not get to sit down for this." Dennis looked at me for a long moment. Then he put his hands on the armrests of the plastic chair and pushed himself to his feet. His knees shook. He stood there in the hallway with his arms at his sides, unfolded for the first time since he had arrived at this hospital, and he was smaller standing than he had been sitting, The posture that had made him fill every room had been a trick of angles and attitude, and without it he was just a 55-year-old electrician with gray hair and grease under his nails, and a daughter he had thrown away standing 6 feet in front of him in surgical scrubs. I took my phone from my pocket. I opened the voicemail folder. I found the message, the one I had been carrying for 12 years through every phone upgrade and every late-night scroll past his name. I pressed play. I held the phone between us with the speaker facing the ceiling. His voice filled the hallway. Younger, harder. The voice of a man who had just finished doing something terrible and had already begun the work of convincing himself it was justified. When you come to your senses, you know my number. I won't be the one apologizing. The message ended. The hallway was quiet except for the vending machine and the distant sound of a cart being wheeled across tile somewhere on another floor. Dennis stared at the phone in my hand. He was hearing his own voice played back to him in a hospital corridor at 7:30 in the morning, and the voice on that recording belonged to a man who had left a message for a 13-year-old girl standing at a gas station in the rain and told her that she was the one who needed to apologize. "That is the last thing you ever said to me," I said. "I was 13 years old. I was standing at a Shell station 2 miles from your house with a backpack full of wet clothes and nowhere to go." I played that message and I thought, he wants me to apologize. A child, in a thunderstorm, for something I did not do. Leah, I was hurting, and you were hurting. I know. Your wife left. I know. Kristen told you something and you believed her without asking a single question. I know all of that. But you had choices, Dennis. You could have driven to any pharmacy in Bend and bought a $30 paternity test. You could have asked me if it was true. You could have called Lorraine that night instead of waiting for me to do it. You could have picked up the phone any day in the past 12 years. You could have done anything at all besides point at a door and go back to your football game. I didn't. You didn't. That is exactly the point. You did nothing. For 12 years, you did nothing. And then you drove 3 hours to this hospital and sat in a plastic chair and cried and told me we could start fresh, as if those 12 years were something I could fold up and put away because you were finally ready to feel like a good father again. Dennis's face changed. I watched something leave it. The thing that left was the story he had been telling himself. The story where he was the wounded husband and the abandoned father, and the man who had tried his best in an impossible situation. I watched it go the way you watch a tide pull back from a beach, leaving behind whatever had been hidden under the water. What was underneath was just a man standing in a hallway who had heard his own voice asking a child to apologize for being thrown out in a storm, and there was nothing he could say to make that voice belong to someone else. "I'm not asking for an apology," I said. "An apology would not change what happened, and it would not give back what I lost. I just needed you to hear what you sounded like. That's all I came here to do." I put the phone back in my pocket. I looked at Dennis standing there in the hallway with his arms at his sides and his chin trembling and the overhead lights making his gray hair look white. Then I turned and walked toward the elevator. My footsteps were even. My breathing was steady. My hands, the hands that had saved his daughter's life, were still. Behind me, I heard the creak of plastic as Dennis sat back down in the hallway chair. The same chair, the same posture, but the man in it was different. The man in it had just listened to a recording of the person he swore he would never become, and the recording was in his own voice, and it had been saved for 12 years by the girl he had told to come to her senses. I did not look back. The days after that passed the way hospital days always pass. One shift bleeding into the next with meals from the cafeteria and coffee at 2 in the morning, and the steady rhythm of patients and charts, and the particular exhaustion that lives in the feet and the lower back, and the space behind the eyes. I transferred Kristen's case to another resident on Friday morning. The paperwork took 15 minutes. I signed my name at the bottom of the transfer form, and that was the last time my signature appeared on anything related to Whitfield. Kristen A. Room 412. Kristen was discharged on the 5th day. Dennis drove her back to Bend. I was in surgery when they left, which was not a coincidence. I had checked the discharge schedule and signed up for a case that would keep me in the OR during the window when Dennis would be walking through the lobby and out to the parking lot. I did not want another hallway conversation. I did not want the awkward pause at the exit or the final plea or the hug that would have been offered and declined. I had said everything I came to say. The rest was his. Lorraine stayed for 2 days after that night in the parking garage. She slept on my couch and cooked in my kitchen, which was the first time anyone had turned on the stove in that apartment. She made chicken soup on the first night and scrambled eggs on the second morning, and she watched 3 episodes of a cooking competition show while I sat on the other end of the couch with my feet tucked under a blanket and my eyes half closed. She did not ask about Dennis. She did not ask about Kristen. She did not ask what I had said in the hallway, or what had been said to me in room 412, or whether I was thinking about calling anyone or forgiving anyone or starting anything fresh. She asked me whether the pothos plant needed more water and whether my landlord had fixed the draft by the bedroom window, and on the second morning she drove back to Salem with a wave and the words, "Call me Sunday." I bought a second pothos plant the day after she left. I put it on the kitchen counter next to the stove she had used, in a spot where the afternoon light came through for about 2 hours. I did not know exactly why I bought it. I just wanted something else alive in the apartment, something green and quiet that would keep growing without needing much from me. Sunday came, 7 in the evening. My phone rang and Lorraine's name appeared on the screen, the same name at the same time on the same day of the week, the rhythm that had not broken once in 12 years. "Did you eat?" "Faux. The place on Burnside. The one with the bad parking? That's the one." "Good." A pause. "Anything else?" I leaned against the kitchen counter with the phone against my ear and looked at the 2 pothos plants on the windowsill and the counter, their leaves catching the last of the evening light. I thought about what I wanted to say, and then I said the simplest version of it. "I'm okay." Lorraine was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had the same warmth it always had. The warmth of someone who had been watching you build yourself from scratch for 12 years and had never once doubted how it would turn out. "I know you are," she said. "You've been okay since you were 13. That was never the question." "What was the question?" "Whether you'd let yourself believe it." I hung up and stood in the kitchen for a while. Then I walked to the coat rack by the front door and unclipped the name badge from my jacket. I held it in my palm. Dr. L. Whitfield. The laminate still had the crease from where I had gripped it in the cafeteria, running my thumb across the letters while Dennis sat across from me and tried to erase 12 years with 2 words. The crease would stay. Everything stays. The name on the badge was the same name as the man who had thrown me out, the same name as the sister who had lied. I had carried that name through foster care paperwork and scholarship applications and medical school lectures and 9-hour surgeries, and somewhere along the way, it had stopped belonging to the family that gave it to me and started belonging to the life I had built with it. I had filled it with things they would never know about. Sunday phone calls and chicken soup in a studio apartment on Northwest 23rd, with 2 pothos plants and a dent in the couch cushion where my aunt had sat and watched cooking shows and asked me nothing harder than whether I had eaten. I clipped the badge back onto my coat. I turned off the kitchen light. I went to bed early for the first time.